What happens in the Arctic directly impacts homeland defense, North American security, and global stability. The core question is simple. Can the United States and Canada and the allies that support them come up with a credible and integrated Arctic strategy? And are we moving fast enough to compete with Russia and China?
Well, I'm pretty sure we're going to hear about more conventional threats as we move down the line with this panel. But let me say that I think this hybrid warfare challenge that we face, where you have a weak to non-existent rule of law, you have a lot of communities that are very impoverished, that may be enticed by either bribes or promises of big investments or quick, easy money through drug transit. And so I should think that one of the big challenges that we have is how do we preserve North America for North Americans, and how do we keep unwanted malign influences from penetrating further into our mutual sphere of interest, and what are the practical things that we can do to try to prevent that?
And I think you're right on there, Chuck. And I think one of the other challenges that the Arctic presents is, for a long time it was seen as kind of an inaccessible area suitable only for rugged exploration and treated as something of a global commons, where those explorers, mostly European and North American, would abide by the same set of rules, provide mutual support to one another when something went wrong. And what we're seeing now is, as there's competition for routes, for resources, and when we say resources, we think oil, gas, maybe minerals, but also protein, meaning fish biomass in the Arctic. That treatment as a global commons no longer works. And the idea that the rules-based international order is going to preserve order there is to me, it's the Maginot Line of the 21st century. That rules-based international order is being exploited on a daily basis in a multitude of different ways by our competitors, and only by working together will we identify, deter, and apply consequences to them.
It's interesting. Rules are only as good as those who follow them, right? I would say probably the biggest challenge in the Arctic is domain awareness. It's about knowing what's going on up there, so that way you can do something about it. That's really the fundamental piece. We talk often about engagement with Russia in the Arctic. NORAD is deeply familiar with that. China kind of certainly highlighting itself as an Arctic interested nation. And of course, the traditional threats that are associated with coming over top of the pole, worst case scenarios when you're talking about ballistic missiles and the like, but also the approaches from the west and from the east. So when you're talking about domain awareness, if you've got a geography that's so large, that's an archipelago, that is not densely populated, you need a lot of activity, you need a lot of assets to be able to provide that knowledge of what's going on, so then you know how to target those people or those things, those activities that are in those areas, and you know what to do about them.
Just echoing Colonel here, domain awareness in the traditional sense, as we talked about, but I also agree with Chuck and the Rear Admiral, domain awareness, but also what's going on, including kind of in the economic sphere and the hybrid sphere. So things like the Investment Canada Act are really sort of following through on what's being invested by other actors and understanding what's behind it. But like we've seen, Russia remains the greatest military threat. China has the potential to be a significant disruptor across economic, scientific, and military domains, and we're seeing that. And I think in addition to everything that our colleagues at National Defense are doing, there's a lot of work going on, or will be a lot of work going on, in terms of building the economic resilience of sort of our northern communities, and to make sure that they're not sort of swayed by foreign actors. When we engage with northerners, their aspect of security is kind of food security, health, access to education, healthcare, and all those things. And those are things that need to sort of be built up to ensure the security broadly, in addition to kind of the conventional security aspects.
So, in your mind, what do you think is something that Americans underestimate about the Arctic from your perspective?
I wouldn't just put Americans in this. I would say even Canadians. I mean, the vast majority of Canadians live in the southern portions of Canada. So even our appreciation of the vast scale of Canada's Arctic is really unknown. I mean, a great example is There's an operation that the Air Force conducts, Operation Box Top, where we do resupply for for the world's most northerly, persistently inhabited station, CFS, Canadian Forces Station Alert. And so we do resupply to that. And they typically come out of southern Ontario. To get halfway for that resupply, they go to Baffin Island. And Baffin Island, from a Canadian's perspective, that's the high north. And it's not. It's only about halfway to get there. It's incredible when you think about that. It's big space. It's an archipelago. And so the scale of the environment is immense, absolutely immense. And the ability to be able to cross that environment is immense. The ability for us to build out infrastructure in those areas is incredibly challenging because you're sitting on top of a frozen tundra. And so then the challenge then, if you're looking at scale and the speed at which that environment is changing and the speed at which adversaries are considering exploitation in those areas, how do you persist? How do you maintain persistence in that environment to be a credible deterrent?
Completely agree. I mean, I had scale as the issue. I mean, just size-wise, the Canadian Arctic is 1.7 million square miles. That's about 6.5 times the size of Texas, 4 times the size of Alaska. So it is vast, but it's also incredibly inhospitable terrain. Very difficult to move around. That's why there's very few roads, because you can't navigate through with roads. It's also an archipelago. So getting there, the navigation season is short. So there's a saying that everything that you do, there's a rule of 4. It takes 4 times as long and costs 4 times more to do it. And things must be adapted to the conditions. It's not just working in the north, it's working in the Arctic. So how do you adapt your radios, your fuel, your batteries, your lubricants to be able to function in those environments? How do you fire your rifle with mitts? Things like that, right? So those are the things we kind of underestimate. And the building and delivery cycle for getting sort of big, heavy kit upstairs, again, it's a very limited navigation window to bring stuff in. And if you forget something, then you've got to wait another sort of year or a season before you can actually get it in.
From the Canadian government's perspective, what's driving Arctic policy? Is it continental defense? Is it the political pressure? Is it just, defense needs to be re-upped in its time?
I think I would say all of the above, really. You've highlighted a mix of issues to consider. We're realizing that the threat environment has changed, and so we need to sort of take charge of that.
Or do you see a role that the U.S. or some other allies could play in that investment?
I should certainly think that the U.S. would be wise to look to, for example, Canadian innovation when it comes to things like hybrid drones, for example, that are designed to work in harsh temperature conditions and have a longer range. That's an example of something where I think the Canadians could very easily lead and essentially relieve the U.S. of the burden of designing and producing that sort of a tool. I think there's all kinds of things when it comes to Arctic warfare and surveillance that in a relatively limited defense procurement budget, it would make sense for the Canadians to specialize in that and then potentially sell it not only to the U.S., but to the Norwegians or the Swedes or the Finns.
And then I would add that because of the unique relationship of the U.S. and Canada in NORAD, that could be leveraged to improve our space-based surveillance capabilities. And it's great that we actually have an Air and Space Force attaché here, because even maritime domain awareness, what the U.S. Coast Guard is looking for, really at this point now in the Arctic needs to go from the seabed to space, because with the extended continental shelf claims of the Arctic nations, virtually every square mile, kilometer, however you want to measure it, of the Arctic Ocean, seabed is now claimed as extended continental shelf by one or more than one of the Arctic nations. And so that surveillance of the seabed, the water column, the water surface, the ice pack, the ice-shore interactions, the atmosphere and space, that there needs to be a continuum of knowledge there that's shared between the U.S. and Canada, and NORAD is probably a good facility to do that. As NATO partners, we're looking for a 5% contribution, 3.5% in traditional security, 1.5% in other. And so maybe this kind of specialization that Chuck mentioned, where Canada has companies, industry, and experience in the very specialized capabilities that are needed to operate in the high north, maybe they skew their investment in that direction while the U.S. and others skew in more conventional forces that are more applicable in the lower latitudes.
We touched on NORAD a little bit in the last panel that I was moderating on Canada, but could you go over a little bit just NORAD and what that looks like, and I guess going forward now with NORAD modernization and how the U.S. could play a role?
Okay, yeah. So NORAD, the binational defense consortium cooperative that's based in Colorado Springs, it's a product of the Cold War, but its viability continues well beyond the Cold War. As mentioned, the hybrid threats and the availability now of missile technology to actors beyond the traditional Russia was the problem, China, North Korea, even Iran, those over-the-pole orbits can very quickly access the population centers of North America and Europe. And so it's absolutely vital. And one of the Trump administration moves to bring Greenland into the NORTHCOM and NORAD area of operations rather than the European Command area of operations was done to actually strengthen our ability to have that space domain, air and space domain awareness over the poles and over the Arctic.
Yeah, I think some of the history behind NORAD is fascinating. It traditionally was designed, like the Admiral had said, it was about the northern approaches and making sure that you could prevent the Russian bear from bringing long-range attack in over top of Canada and to attack the United States and, of course, consequentially with Canada. And so that remains extant. However, with respect to space-based assets and the advancements of ballistic missiles, which no longer follow hyperbolic trajectories that you can mathematically calculate, the approaches are no longer Arctic. The approaches are now west, east, they're all around the clock. They're down south as well. And so what could be interpreted as a standard satellite launch from another part of the country, it may not carry satellites. It might carry something that can just orbit the Earth and then come on down whenever it needs to. And so that holds you at threat. The whole point about NORAD modernization is about looking at the current environment and the forecasted environment which is manifesting, and finding ways for us to be able to provide a credible deterrent to our adversaries so that way they understand that today's not the day. I think the neatest part about NORAD, it is the world's only binational command. There's no two countries in the world, no other two countries in the world who actually entrust in another country their members and their forces to be able to have the responsibility for part of the defense of their own country. Like a Canadian, for example, was the one who shut down American airspace post 9/11. That's amazing to think about that. The amount of trust that's required at the operational, the tactical, and strategic level inside the militaries, so that way we can operate together to defend our continent collectively.
How do you think that each country should approach the situation that we have right now, and what's the path forward? What does that look like, especially with NORAD modernization and those partnerships and the current environment that we're dealing with our adversaries too?
So I guess this is the time when we get to be extra diplomatic with ourselves and with the audience. The facts on the ground are what they are. And the fact is that, of course, we've had a pretty significant holiday from reality, from history, for a couple of decades after the end of the Cold War. And there's a lot of catching up to do. And different nations are looking at this catching up more seriously than others. And I know that Canada is beginning to accelerate, but it's from an extremely low floor. And I doubt that there is political will to do much more than is currently being anticipated, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned previously the specialization. If you are going to develop force structure and have investments, it really ought to be in areas that are very unique and really accentuate the specialized advantage that the Canadians would have. I think that regardless of any sort of near-term ramifications of President Trump's criticisms of Canada or Prime Minister Carney's apparent warming up to the People's Republic of China, the bottom line is that China's predatory capitalistic mercantilistic model is not going to allow any significant importation of Canadian finished goods other than for the purpose of ripping them off from an intellectual property standpoint. Certainly they'll welcome raw material, but that's not going to necessarily sustain the Canadian standard of living. So I would hope that at some point, as reality begins to set in, we can resume a very vigorous, mutually beneficial relationship. I think it's inevitable, but certainly political egos are a thing, something I learned from my time in elected office. And sometimes they can prevent people from doing wise actions that benefit their constituency.
I'd like to salute a wise action that the government of Canada took relatively recently, which was moving its Coast Guard from a purely civilian agency to within the Ministry of Defense to make it a national security component, recognizing that maritime domain awareness and presence is vital to national security and sovereignty.
So how can you describe what China and Russia are doing in the Arctic right now?
Well, sure. We talked briefly about the Northern Sea Route. As that opens up, Russia accesses a lot of its oil and gas industry through that Northern Sea Route. They have plants on the Arctic coast. They also are doing significant military development along the Arctic coast, reviving Cold War-era bases of all types, air bases, space bases, including on Wrangel Island, which is an island that the Soviets basically just took adverse possession of against the United States back in the 1920s, and the U.S. hasn't asserted a claim to it, but the Russians have developed it militarily. And for commercial traffic, they require icebreaker escorts, and that's basically their tolling system along the Northern Sea Route. And the forecast is that as ice opens up, that route will make a trip from Asia to, say, Rotterdam faster and cheaper than going through the Straits of Malacca and the Suez Canal. And then similarly, as the ice recedes and more cartography is done of the Northwest Passage of Canada, there's a potential to go from the Bering Strait, say Japan, to Europe in a, not dealing with Russia, but instead going across the U.S. and Canada. And then ultimately, if there's a true ice-free Arctic in 2050 or whatever the projections are, then a straight polar route from the Bering Strait to the coast of Western Europe is available, and it saves, in some cases, about 40% of the time and the sea transport expense of some of those things. And then similarly, China, calling itself a near-Arctic nation, at a point last summer had 5 ice-breaking vessels doing research on the U.S. extended continental shelf claim north of Alaska. And the U.S. was able to basically send somebody to watch them for a while, but we really couldn't, under international law, push them out. There weren't statutory teeth to be able to tell them to move along.
You think that they were reconning potential deep water basins for their strategic ballistic nuclear submarines?
Oh, they can certainly be doing that. Like I said, they're basically looking in the windows of our water space and our seabed resources to consider how they might exploit them. And again, the Chinese and their fishing fleet has already virtually emptied the Bering Sea and the Northern Pacific. And so the Arctic Ocean is very likely to be the next, particularly if the oceans continue to warm. These very prolific and productive cold water species will have to move north, and Chinese fishing fleets will almost certainly go to the Arctic to find them.